As most 15-year-olds do, I spend a lot of time complaining about minor inconveniences. From an outdated iPhone to slow Wi-Fi, the list of mild irritants goes on and on. We all have things that irritate us, but it's important to remember that, no matter how bad the circumstance may seem, it could always be worse. Unless you're the protagonist in an ancient epic, because that's about as bad as it gets. Two of the most lazily named epics prove this, the Odyssey and Gilgamesh, which follow the plight of, you guessed it, Odysseus and Gilgamesh. While the stories of these two epic heroes may be very different, the character traits that result in their success are surprisingly similar, as are the faults that impair them. One of the main similarities between the two is their unmatched perseverance. While I can barely get through an hour-long biology class, Odysseus goes through trials that make Chuck Norris look like Tiny Tim. Don't believe me? Let's dive in. One of the more obvious examples of Odysseus' endurance takes place after his entire crew of more than 600 men are killed, all in different grisly and unflattering ways, from being eaten alive by giants, to being eaten alive by a cyclops, to being eaten alive by a sea goddess, to being drunk and falling off of a roof. As Odysseus is floating alone at sea for an unclear amount of time, he wakes up to find that he's drifting towards the Strait of Messina, inhabited by two sea goddesses, but these aren't your everyday run-of-the-mill ocean deities, no, far from it. Both of them are cold-blooded monsters, one of which has a giant crab shell, 6 necks, 3 rows of teeth per head, and 12 feet. And the other is just a giant mouth that makes whirlpools, both of which should mean certain death. Miraculously, Odysseus manages to pass through the strait relatively unharmed after hanging from the branch of a fig tree for 8 hours, waiting for Charybdis to spit up part of his ship so he could keep on his journey home to Ithaca. I can't do a single pull-up, and Odysseus can support at least 200 pounds of his own weight for 8 hours. If that doesn't scream endurance, nothing does. On the Gilgamesh side of things, after tragically losing his best friend Enkidu, he ventures out into the unknown to find the key to everlasting life. After being warned by a half-human, half-scorpion creature known as Man-Scorpion, sure that one took a while to think up, Gilgamesh decides to venture into the Mountain of Darkness the unfortunately named Hybrid Guards. As he begins his journey, darkness quickly swallows him, leaving him to wander blindly for miles. As it's described in the epic, when he had gone 1 league, the darkness became thick around him, for there was no light. He could see nothing ahead and nothing behind him. After 2 leagues, the darkness was thick and there was no light. He could see nothing ahead and nothing behind him. After 3 leagues, the darkness was thick. You see the pattern. This goes on for 12 leagues, only to be interrupted 8 leagues in, with Gilgamesh unleashing, and I quote, a great cry, for the darkness was thick, and he could see nothing ahead and nothing behind him. Now you may be thinking, well, how long is a league? If it's like 12 feet, then that's not that bad. Well, that's where the endurance part comes in. According to Google, a league is roughly 3.5 miles, meaning he walked 28 miles in complete darkness, screamed a little bit, and then walked another 14 miles in complete darkness. That's 42 miles in total, the same length as roughly 739 football fields, 5,544 school buses, and the distance from McLean, Virginia to Baltimore, all without water, sleep, or AirPods. I didn't even have the endurance to read out the whole quote, and he managed to come out the other side no worse for wear, although seeing as he began his journey depressed and disgusting, that's not saying much. Still, it shows that Gilgamesh is unequivocally persistent, enduring pains that would drive most to insanity or to death. However, it's important to note that these two ancient heroes weren't always as heroic. In fact, quite the opposite, just admittedly in different ways. Odysseus wasn't completely rotten at the beginning of the epic, just kind of a jerk. One of the more well-known examples of his hubris, as well as his stupidity, takes place on the island of the Cyclopes, as him and his crew venture into the cave of Polyphemus. Now, Odysseus and his crew initially went in just to steal some food and get back on course, but wouldn't you know it, for the 80 millionth time, luck was not on Odysseus' side. The Cyclops came back and imprisoned them all, but not before eating 2 of his crew members whole. Now, Odysseus could have easily killed the Cyclops, but the boulder that Polyphemus used to close the entrance to the cave could only be moved by him, so killing the Cyclops would mean being trapped inside the cave. Instead, Odysseus manages to blind the Cyclops and straps his men to the underside of Polyphemus' sheep, so as they were let out to graze, Odysseus and his crew escape right under the Cyclops' nose. At this point, they should be able to just get back on the ship and leave, but Odysseus, being an idiot, decides to not only tease the Cyclops, bragging about having blinded him, but also name-drop himself like a Pokemon or a wrestler, declaring, "If ever a mortal man ask how you were put to shame and blinded, tell him Odysseus, raider of cities, took your eye, Laertes' son, whose home's on Ithaca." Now this wouldn't really be a big deal if it weren't for Polyphemus' dad, who just happens to be Poseidon. You know, the god of the ocean. So Polyphemus prays to his father and begs him to curse Odysseus, which Poseidon immediately fulfills despite having probably hundreds of other children. What makes this example so completely baffling is that Odysseus was completely home free, and he still decided to be a good idea to effectively dox himself, not only giving out his name, but the name of his father and his homeland. That's like breaking into someone's house and then leaving a note with your name and address on it. It goes to show that Odysseus would stop at nothing to gain the clout he thought he deserved. What makes it even even better is that Odysseus' crew literally told him not to, and he just completely ignored him. They actually told him, "Hey, we're almost out of here, so can you maybe, not draw attention to us and get us killed?" And he just kept going. Taking all this into consideration, it's not hard to see why Odysseus wasn't exactly a noble hero at the beginning of the epic. However, to be fair, the stuff that Gilgamesh did makes Odysseus look like Mother Teresa. Cussing out a Cyclops and getting cursed is bad, but Gilgamesh was a whole lot worse. In fact, the very first thing you learn about Gilgamesh in the epic is that he's a complete sociopath. I'm serious. It begins with the men of Uruk complaining. His arrogance has no bounds by day or night. His lust leaves no virgin to her lover, neither the warrior's daughter nor the wife of the noble. Yeah. Do I really need to elaborate on that? I think him being a rapist is enough to prove my point. Not the most noble leader, not by a long shot. Side note, what makes the whole thing weirder is the solution to the problem. Instead of the gods just killing him or telling him to stop, they just made Sumerian Chewbacca and hoped that would solve the problem, which for some reason works until Enkidu dies, which is a whole other problem, and we'll get to that. But don't worry, both of our protagonists have redemption arcs, setting the precedent for many sports movies to come. Odysseus manages to shape up by the time he gets back to Ithaca, which means it took him 20 years to learn how to not be a complete tool, but hey, better late than never. A prime example of Odysseus as a changed man can be seen after killing his wife's suitors. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but to an extent they deserved it, seeing as they spent 20 years harassing a widow who they knew didn't want to marry any of them. After killing all the suitors with the help of his completely incompetent son and the goddess Athena, an old nurse Euryclea comes down and sees the absolute carnage and begins to celebrate. However, Odysseus is quick to correct her, telling her, "Rejoice in your heart, old woman, peace, no cries of triumph now. It's unholy to glory over the bodies of the dead." Basically saying, hey, don't shout and cheer when you kill people. I'm not sure that applied when Odysseus so proudly dubbed himself the Raider of Cities, but either way, it goes to show that Odysseus has learned that all life is valuable, and that the loss of it is not something to be disregarded. Somehow being exposed to so much death throughout his journey made him more sensitive to it, which I think can be attributed to seeing so many of his men die for so many years. But yeah, redemption arc number 1, check. Okay, with Gilgamesh, it's a little bit different just because he's so much worse. This isn't a redemption arc, this is like a redemption roller coaster. Despite having once enslaved his entire kingdom just to build some stupid walls, and having violently assaulted every woman in Uruk, he comes out on the other side a pretty okay dude. Enkidu was created to balance out Gilgamesh's unbridled arrogance, and their friendship manages to make Gilgamesh a calmer, more reflective leader, who from that point on would not enslave or rape his citizens. An ideal king. The people of Uruk knew the effect Enkidu would have, rejoicing. Now Gilgamesh has met his match. This great one, this hero whose beauty is like a god. He's a match even for Gilgamesh. Now, one might think, wait, Enkidu eventually bites it, so wouldn't that mean Gilgamesh just goes back to being a jerk? Well, surprisingly no, he doesn't go back to being horrible, but he does have an existential crisis as he realizes that he, one day, will die, just like Enkidu. After Enkidu's untimely demise, Gilgamesh ventures out into the unknown to try to find the key to everlasting life, but returns to Uruk empty-handed, which for most would be enough to break their spirit for good. But Gilgamesh has a surprisingly reflective outlook on his journey. As he looks back on the kingdom he built in all its glory, he tells his companion, Urshanabi, climb up onto the wall of Uruk, inspect its foundation terrace, and examine well the brickwork. See if it is not of burnt bricks, and did not the 7 wise men lay these foundations? 1/3 of the whole is city, 1/3 is garden, and 1/3 is field, with the precinct of the goddess Ishtar. These parts and the precinct are all Uruk. Now at first when I read this, I saw it as him just bragging about how great Uruk is, but when it gets down to it, his appreciation of Uruk and its walls shows him finally taking a moment to step back and appreciate the work that he and the citizens he rules over have accomplished, further proving he's learned the value of his city and his people, and has grown as a person. Enkidu is still dead, but I didn't write the story, so you're just gonna have to deal with this half-happy ending. The plights of Gilgamesh and Odysseus are certainly lengthy ones, but their perseverance allows them to push through astounding trials and tribulation. While they may begin the tale as complete knobs, they learn humility and restraint through their journeys, and come out the other side noble and just rulers. As the heroic archetype is fulfilled, and they both return to their kingdoms, changed for the better, it presents the reader with a question. Where are you on your hero's journey? My name is Judge Chalk, and I'm sick of quarantine. Get me out of here. Thank you for watching.